Good afternoon. First, I will say what I consider necessary, then I will answer the questions, and then we will deal with the sufficiently general theory of governance. This week, announcements have appeared on several websites that a fundraiser is underway to support the authorship collective of the internal predictor of the USSR. In fact, the internal predictor of the USSR did not come forward with this initiative, and in the form in which it took place, we find it inappropriate. We have no need for this now. On the other hand, crowdfunding is a widely used means of collecting money to finance these or those projects. Since this is a widespread instrument, and, indeed, many projects can be carried out only on the basis of this, then indeed there is nothing vicious about it, provided that the norms of ethics are observed. That is, those who organize such initiatives must submit a project, must submit an approximate evaluation of this project, and further, during the implementation of the project, they must inform those who have contributed to it about how the project is ongoing, what results are being achieved, and how the collected money is being spent. This is the first thing. The second thing consists in the fact that the internal predictor of the USSR is not a hockey team, where there is a main team, there is a backup team, there is a youth team in several compositions, the main team plays, the backup team helps. Well, while the young people are training, then they go through the trials and move to the adult teams. The internal predictor is not like this. We are not a Masonic lodge, which sets itself the task of reproducing itself in the continuity of generations. Moreover, the task of building some kind of structure that will behave in the future as now, or over the past 20 years, the internal predictor of the USSR behaves. This task is not set. The reason is simple. The main task is to give out to society knowledge on the basis of which everyone who wishes can develop skills of conceptual powerfulness. Well, and whoever does not wish, this is also his right. He wants to be a tolerator and a slave of the circumstances that others create, then, fine, so be it. But in this case there is no need to complain about the hardships of life. Therefore, there is no youth composition of the internal predictor of the USSR. As for the original composition, everyone, thank God, is alive, healthy, working, except for one person. Unfortunately, Pyotr Sokolov, a worker from Severodvinsk, left this world a long time ago. He did what he could, and what he could not, he didn't. Therefore, in our vision, society should be conceptually powerful. Conceptual powerfulness cannot be concentrated in some shadow structures of the society. Conceptually powerful people should enter into bodies of state power. The state planning committee must appear over time, which should provide governance towards the state according to the predictor-corrector scheme. But, again, this is only possible in the case that the whole society is conceptually powerful, on the basis that all knowledge and skills necessary for this are open for everyone to master. Now let's turn to the questions. Question. Last time I could not ask a question on the term matrix, because I still have this feeling of some non-determination of this concept, both in the contextual and imaginary sense. Hence, in the technical metrological sense too. Perhaps this only concerns me and a number of listeners. As for the rest, I cannot say. Perhaps I need a detailed definition from someone from the collective of authors, but judge for yourself. In the lecturer's speeches, first, the matrix sometimes acts in the role of a cliché for an imprint or at least a package of dynamically changing such clichés. And clichés, imprints, stamps are becoming a key word as technology for imprinting and impressing. Second, sometimes, listening to a lecture, I imagine an ordinary multi-measured matrix from mathematics, brought to the level of multi-measured holography. When we change the element of every cell, we get changes in the entire matrix. These are only two of the closest ideas, but I would like to sharpen, to actually correlate it with the meaning, because a dead cliché and a living model of reality cannot be called the same thing. The representative of the collective of authors just says it and moves on, but you sit and break your imaginative thinking. If both my images are not correct and are far from what was implied, then this is an evaluation of the whole presentation of the theory and its elaboration. Why so many thick books? Isn't it time to finally make a thick dictionary for the internal predictor? Because the term is encountered very often, and I have not come across its more or less exhaustive definition. Where can I read about this? Well, I also imagine a multi-measured matrix in a mathematical sense. Well, life, this is the filling of the cells with energy, matter, and the flow of energy and matter from one cell into another. This is how I imagine it. The very definition of matrix, measure, is a plurality of all possible states of matter and the path of the transition of matter from one state into others. This is in relation to matter, in relation to information, to meaning. The matrix plays the role of an information coding system. Well, nevertheless, it is really so that every person should form some of his own imaginative understandings about what it is. Well, the legend of Pygmalion, who created the statue, and then the statue came to life. What is this about? This is about the fact that there was a shift in the matrix. The molecules, atoms, that were part of the marble statue disappeared, and the same form was filled with a different content, differently organized matter, as a result of which a living girl appeared. The only question is, where did the soul of this girl come from, if it came? Question. Mikhail Viktorovich, thank you for the lectures and the answers to the questions. The effectiveness of the functioning of the supersystem largely depends on the accumulated information when interacting with the environment and the speed of spread of this information between the elements of the supersystem. In the mid-1920s, the USSR accumulated vast experience in prognosing crises, black swans, and using these prognoses in political and economic activities. Now, this is not taught in the higher educational institutions, and this knowledge would be in great demand for a more detailed understanding of the third priority of governance. There is one site where S.E. Doroshenko, albeit not for free and with not entirely clear objectives, covers these questions. But this resource alone is clearly not enough. How do you evaluate this resource? Unfortunately, about 2 years ago, V.A. Yefimov, to a similar question, said that he was not familiar with his activities. Well, even now, I am not familiar with his activities. As for the analytics in the 1920s and 1930s, which supposedly provided the prediction of crises, now, if we turn to the scientific methodological support of that time, then Marxism does not provide such knowledge that would make it possible to prognose crises, although this really took place. Academician Yevgeny Samuilovich Varga predicted a crisis. This prediction was taken as the basis of the politics of the country, and Joseph Vissarionovich treated him with a certain respect precisely because he predicted the crisis. How did he predict? By all appearances, intuitively. Moreover, crises are all of a governed character, because a certain potential for a crisis is created. This potential can be reduced, and the pre-crisis state can be maintained for quite a long time. Well, at the right time, when a decision is made on what should happen as a result of the crisis, how property should be redistributed, what political events and scenarios can be written off on the crisis, then this crisis potential is simply not reduced, and, in some cases, the crisis can come simply as a result of further accumulation of the crisis potential spontaneously. This is roughly something like stretching continuously some rubber band. It will surely snap someday. Or a crisis can be provoked at the right time, simply by exerting an impact on this crisis potential. Well, it's the same as taking a stretched elastic band and cutting it with scissors. Therefore, the question of predicting a crisis, this is a difficult question, because there have been no ungoverned crises, at least since the 20th century. And further, the question arises, what subjects can govern the crisis? What are their intentions? And this is a slightly different theme of predicting the crisis, because here it is necessary to take into account the concretics of psychology, and you can't read the soul of another. This is one side of the question. And the second side of the question is those scenarios that globalists implement in every concrete era. Good day. About the hero of Russia, Roman Filipov. I suppose that the global predictor wanted to show the world a traitor of a new quality, after our athletes who compete under the white flag. It is clear that a living pilot was needed for the subsequent treatment with torture and chemical substances. But this plan of the global predictor did not work. What do you think? Thank you for your reply. Well, in fact, the capture of prisoners, this has always been considered a military success. Well, if the prisoner was forced to talk about how he was dissatisfied with life in his homeland, and how he is now happy with life in captivity, this was always considered a certain success. Whether the prisoner really expressed such thoughts himself out of the bounty of his soul, on the basis of nraviously conditioned convictions, or as the result of torture and pressure from the instinct of self-preservation, this is a matter of every particular case. Therefore, if Roman Filipov had been captured alive, then, of course, work on this theme would have been carried out in relation to him. But since he didn't let them capture him alive, then it is a feat worthy of respect. Condolences to the family, condolences to comrades, friends, and everyone else should be worthy of the memory of people like him. Next question. Could you express your opinion on this definition of the concept of governance? Governance is finding commensurate meanings and algorithms for the factors of the environment on which the impact is exerted. Well, this is somewhat disfluent governance. By the word governance, we understand a setting of objectives and implementation of this setting of objectives in life. Of course, setting of objectives occurs under the impact of the environment, which causes discomfort and causes the need for governance, the first stage of the entire function. Question. Further, there is a notification that love is one and divine. Under any circumstances, she is unchangeable. She either is present or is not. Something like this. And are there no other variants? Yes, indeed. Love is either present or is not. Love is self-sufficient in the foundations and objectives of her existence, but love is always concrete in her manifestations. Next question. Thank you for your work. On your recommendation, in one of your lectures, I began to read the books of V. Levi and realized that the collective of authors took a lot from these books. Question. Tell me, have you had personal meetings with Vladimir Levi? And does he know that his worldview is consonant with the conception of social safety? We haven't read all of Levi's books, although indeed we have read something. There were no meetings with Vladimir Levi, and we have no contacts with him. As for the fact that a lot is taken from the books of Levi, you see, we live in one and the same reality. We face the same problems. By force of the fact that the matrix of possibilities is objective, problems are solved either in the same way or, in a sense, in similar ways. Methods of solutions to problems find a description by linguistic means. Therefore, if people really solve problems, then the methods of solution will be more or less the same, and will be expressed in more or less similar lexicon. especially since language is one of the factors that unites many people into one society. Next question. What does material carrier mean in the terminology of the conception of social safety? This means a material carrier of some characteristics, which themselves are not material. Immaterial characteristics, immaterial properties of objects, phenomena, this is information. That is, the functional meaning that they carry. Algorithmics, a system of coding and transformation of information, which are also carried by these very material carriers. Question. For example, if we photographed the image of a flower from a flower bed onto a photographic film, then the photographic film can be considered a material carrier of the image of the flower from the flower bed. Yes, we can consider the image of the material carrier of the image of the flower from the flower bed. Question. And what is the material carrier for the flower itself from the flower bed, as an original, given that there is no matter objectively? The flower in itself is material, but the image that it has, it is a material carrier in relation to this image. Next question. Is the transition to a biological human civilization possible without changing the climatic conditions on Earth towards those that were observed on the planet in the beginning of times, when it was not necessary to sow and reap? Will God change the climate on Earth to the measure of humanization of the world's population? The last question is not a question for me. The question of climate change is also not obligatory, because, of course, there is a certain window of possibilities in which a person who has mastered the genetically embedded potential of his organism can exist without any additional technical means of protection. It is possible that in some regions of the planet, climatic conditions go beyond this window of possibilities, and, accordingly, these regions of the planet, even in biological civilization, will be unsuitable for life. You see, these are not our tasks. To leave these regions as they are, to change the climate on the planet in one way or the other, to ask God to change the climate on the planet in order that it would live differently. But you see, the questions of the species composition of the biosphere, the distribution of biocenoses around the planet, are connected with the climate. This is not our task, because we are in a situation where a technocratic civilization is developing in such a way that it is capable of destroying both man in the form in which he is and the biosphere, historically shaped in the form in which it is. You see, when it comes to the past, in a number of cases, such ideas are expressed that the current biosphere, by its mass, is about 10 to 20% of the biosphere that once was on the planet. And, in general, these are the remains of the ancient biosphere. Whether the biosphere will be able to revive with a change in the quality of man and transition into some other quality is also an open question and not ours. For us now, the main problem, this is to eliminate the crisis of technocratic civilization. And meanwhile, it seems that a possible way to eliminate this crisis is as follows. Man begins to think, man restores his religiosity, civilization is transformed from a technocratic into an eco-technological civilization. In the conditions of an eco-technological civilization, the meaning of life is not to consume as much as possible and to have sensual pleasures, but the meaning of life is to master the genetic potential of human development and gradually make the technosphere unnecessary, or reduce it to the minimum that will not threaten the stability of the biosphere. One of the questions that can arise in this case can be resolved in an unusual for us way. This is that magic is a certain synthesis of psychology and physics, a synthesis of that psychology and physics that we do not know. And if there arises a need to make something artificial, then it will simply materialize with an effort of will as needed. Well, again, this is now for the majority a chimerical fairy tale. But once again, magic is a certain synthesis of psychology and a synthesis of physics, which we do not know now. Because if correct physics, adequate physics becomes the property of this civilization, then it is able to not only destroy the planet, but much more. In a world without nuclear weapons, life would be somewhat calmer, and a civilization without nuclear weapons would pose less of a threat to itself and to the planet. Question. There is a vital need for lectures on the study of the Quran. I am reading it for the second time and understand many things literally, that is, not correctly. It is difficult for me to orient myself independently. Is it possible to consider the questions of organizing such lectures? There will be no lectures on the Quran. Why? Because I attribute the Quran to those texts that every person who comes across them should read as a message addressed to himself personally, to his beloved self. It is necessary to read the Quran precisely as a message addressed to you personally, without prejudices on the theme that Muhammad lived a long time ago and did not know what modern science knows, without prejudices on the theme that you are smarter than the one who sent down this text. Now, if you read the Quran without prejudice as a message addressed to you personally, then you will certainly face reproaches against your own nraviousness and ethics. Responding to these approaches, you will certainly develop personally and understand what now remains unclear. At the same time, you also need to understand that the Quran, in its historically taken shape form, it is not a chronological sequence of those revelations that were sent down through Muhammad. The text of the Quran, in its current form, was formed after the departure of Muhammad, and it was composed simply in the order. The shorter the record of the chapter of the surah, the further it is from the beginning. Well, in such a form, the Quran did not suit all the companions of Muhammad. Some of the companions of Muhammad recognized the Ottoman version of the Quran as not quite adequate to what they knew. In fact, whether this is so or not, this is on the sovest of those who formed the current text of the Quran, and on the sovest of those who did not recognize the current edition of the Quran as authentic to what was in their memory. Nevertheless, when dealing with the Quran, one must understand that this is a monument of an ancient era, and it contains 3 layers of information. Information addressed directly to Muhammad personally. It was a guide for him in his activities. For us, it represents a historically cognitive aspect, information for pondering, but in no way a guide to action. The second layer of information, this is information addressed to the contemporaries and compatriots of Muhammad. For us, it is also of historical cognitive interest. By strength of the fact that the Arabic language, for the majority of us, is not our native language, by strength of the fact that more than 1,300 years have passed since that time, by strength of the fact that we live in a different culture, this information for us is also not a guide to action. Relevant for us is the third layer of information that is in the Quran, that which is addressed to all people at all times, regardless of nationality, regardless of what prejudices this or that culture formed in us while we walked the path from birth to adulthood. But this meaning of the Quran is simple. People live according to sovest. Sovest is an innate religious sense. Live in dialogue with God, and then everything on earth will be fine. The predestination of man is to be the successor of the Almighty on earth, at least to begin with. Therefore, there will be no lectures on the Quran. If I or someone else starts lecturing on the Quran, he will comment on the text of the Quran, based on his own considerations, based on how he understood it all. Well, since it is hardly possible to understand everything adequately, then anyone who undertakes to lecture on the Quran, presenting his understanding of the Quran as something alternatively true, takes responsibility for those mistakes that, one way or the other, are inherent to his understanding, as well as for those mistakes that he can generate in the audience, by virtue of the fact that somewhere he is inaccurate in word usage, or does not notice the fact that the listeners are not in the mood that allows them to adequately perceive even an adequate meaning. Therefore, there will be no lectures on the Quran. Read the Quran and all other literature, other scriptures recognized as sacred. Read them yourselves. If necessary, master the languages of the original. Well, live by sovest. Further questions. I was very worried about questions of nutrition. Viktor Alexeyevich Yefimov, in his lectures, speaks a lot about the rejection of eating meat, about raw food nutrition, about trophology. I listen to him and understand that in the conditions of the cities of Siberia, Buryatia, at the present time, this is not real. I do not see the way in feeding on imported fruits, store-bought vegetables, to deliberately poison myself. On the other hand, he is the largest supporter of the conception where it's said that eating meat, this is up to a certain point in time. I think maybe the time has already come, and at the same time, I remember Ivan Antonovich Yefremov in The Hour of the Bull. The inhabitants of the earth could not give up eating meat until they learned to create animals from vegetable proteins. As a result, I am completely confused. I am worn out by these thoughts. Towards meat there has appeared a disgust. Later I realized that I had connected with the egregor of vegetarians, and only turning to God allowed me to get rid of the possession. This answer simply removed the stone from my soul. Thanks, I live in peace. I eat as before, answering questions about the opening up of creative capabilities. You indirectly answered another important question for me. The connoisseurs around me try to convince me, altogether, that there is no cause for the common blago. First of all, you do it for yourself, your beloved self, and only then for everyone. Otherwise, you will not achieve the objective. I feel that these are the lessons of the Western liberal conception. I resist internally. There was nothing for me to object with. Now, after your explanations, everything has fallen into place. Realizing that I am right, I act further without doubts. Thank you. Well, what can be said? Indeed, nutrition, as an element of the physiology of the organism, is connected with psychology. But since a person lives in the conditions of a specific natural geographic environment, the historically formed innate nutritions are what they are. And in the conditions of Siberia, the Arctic, an attempt to switch to a different nutrition, especially to a nutrition based on what grows in these regions, this is a dead end. As for vegetables and fruits that are supplied from other regions, you see, until the middle of the 20th century, types of vegetables and fruits were optimized in order to be tasty and healthy. From the second half of the 20th century to the present, types of tasty and healthy fruits and vegetables have been replaced by the type designed in order that they can be transported for a long time, stored for a long time, and they do not lose their presentation. As a result, studies were carried out which showed that the amount of vitamin C in apples grown in the United Kingdom today is about half lower than what was in the early 1960s. Therefore, the question of nutrition, you must, first of all, coordinate with your psychology. You must be attentive to how the organism reacts to this or that food. If you are meaningful and attentive, then somehow you will give up eating something, because this is not appropriate. You will keep something in your nutrition. If you are attentive, your physiology will anyway change, and the biochemistry of the organism will also change in some way. But we always live in concrete conditions. And what is good, for example, for the conditions of the Mediterranean region, is not always good, and in some cases is harmful, for the conditions of Siberia. What is good for the tundra is not realizable in the Mediterranean region, or realizable, but also with great losses for the organism. Therefore, until we reach that level of development, when the source of both energy and mass for the reproduction of the organism is the Holy Spirit, until that time we will, one way or the other, feed on what nature gives. Well, any form of gluttony is one of these sins. Question. There is another reproach, another suspicion, that the internal predictor of the USSR is not right in its composition. Partially, I have answered this question, but where do these reproaches come from? From the fact that the style of presentation of information in the early works and the style of presentation in the works of our days, it is different. You see, when it all began, our prejudices, our world understanding, had been formed by an atheistic culture, a culture of materialistic atheism. And dialectical materialism was perceived as the pinnacle of philosophy. Its gnoseology was perceived as the pinnacle of the methodology of cognition and creativity. But since we were developing, now we have different opinions about gnoseology. Our world understanding has changed, and new works express the world understanding that we have now. Therefore, to insist that the internal predictor of the USSR write now the way they wrote at the beginning of their activity, this is to insist that we fall back into the distant past and become again slaves of dialectical materialism and all the restrictions on cognition and creativity which were imposed by the substitution by Hegel of dialectics as the art of cognizing the truth by posing leading questions for some logic, which he expressed in the three laws of pseudo-dialectics, and which Marxism inherited. Therefore, the people are the same. They strive for the same objectives. But the set of objectives may even have expanded since they began their work. But these are already different people, who know what they did not know back then, and from what they knew back then, much is understood differently now. Once again, the task is not to reproduce the internal predictor of the USSR in the continuity of generations as a certain team that itself conducts this or that volume of work. The task is that there would grow up a generation of conceptually powerful people who would not create problems for subsequent generations and successfully solve the problems inherited from the past. And no one will ever be able, instead of conceptually powerless people, to solve the problems of the society in which they live, because all the conceptually powerless, all in one way or the other atheistic, they create problems for themselves, for those around them, and for subsequent generations. It is necessary to move away from this way of life, from this path of life. Now let's go back to the sufficiently general theory of governance. In past lectures, I repeatedly said that one should read thick books. One needs to work with the text. One needs to try to see behind the words of the texts those natural phenomena that are discussed in the texts. I don't think that the majority of those who have seen these videos follow this advice. Therefore, today, we will work with the text. That is, you need to open the files of the sufficiently general theory of governance, of the preliminary materials, of the training course of the St. Petersburg State University, Faculty of Applied Mathematics and Processes of Governance. And we will turn to section 13, Processes in Supersystems, Possibilities of Flow, section 13.1, Concept of Supersystems. I will read some paragraphs and comment on what is written there. Initially, it was said that the sufficiently general theory of governance was built in such a way that, as a process of governance or a process of self-governance, it is possible to describe any process that flows in nature, in society, in technology, in the psyche of a person, in his organism. And the sufficiently general theory of governance has the quality of the ability to describe all such processes as processes of governance or as processes of self-governance, thanks to the fact that in it there is the concept of a supersystem. The text of the sufficiently general theory of governance. Under supersystem, we understand a set of elements that are at least partially functionally analogous to each other in a certain sense. Analogy and similarity in the context of this work are not synonyms. Analogy suggests the possibility of a direct substitution of one for the other. Similarity, complete or partial, assumes only the identity of the processes occurring in different objects when they are described in a common for them system of parameters, deprived of their real dimensionality. What is this about? Yes, indeed, analogy and similarity, these are not synonyms. Analogy implies the possibility of replacing and obtaining a result as a result of the replacement, which meets our needs. The quality of this result is also an analog of the result that took place before replacing something with an analog. The stove is a device that allowed cooking in the past. A gas stove, an electric stove, is a device that allows you to cook in the present. If you do not find fault with some subtleties, then the result, in fact, is close, although not quite identical to what was. Nevertheless, if we correlate with taste, connoisseurs will say that even in one and the same saucepan, according to one and the same recipe, a dish cooked on a wooden fire differs in taste from a dish cooked on a gas stove or electric stove. This is an example of the fact that the analogy really implies the possibility of substitution and functional similarity. Even an incomplete one, it nevertheless provides a result. And similarity does not imply the possibility of substitution, because, well, in the 1950s, for the solution of dynamic tasks, governance towards aircraft, governance towards missiles, systems of differential equations were used. The computer technology of that time did not allow the solution of these problems of differential equations by numerical methods at all. But nevertheless, there were technical tasks, and they were being solved. How were they being solved? They were solved on the grounds that the same mathematical models described different processes. These same mathematical models helped to describe an airplane in flight and could describe an electronic circuit, which was, in a certain sense, similar to an airplane, for the reason that it was also described by the same differential equations by which the flight of an airplane was described. If you could build an electrical circuit that was dynamically identical, like an airplane in flight, then you could research the flight of an airplane on the basis of the oscilloscope recording of the processes taking place in this circuit. By changing the elements of the circuit, you could change the coefficients that comprised the system of differential equations. The coefficients were in some way connected with the features of the construction of the aerodynamic components of the aircraft. And if your model, built on the basis of an electronic circuit, received not those results that you wanted to see on the airplane, then you could change the construction of the airplane accordingly. Test a new mathematical model on an electronic circuit and find out whether the modification of the aircraft was better or worse. But you could, on this basis, build an acceptable to you airplane. But you could never replace a real airplane at an airport with an electronic circuit. But analogy presupposes the definition of a certain set of qualities possessed by objects that are analogous precisely in the sense of a selected set of qualities. Yes, the variativeness of each quality is possible, but nevertheless, the analogy remains. Nevertheless, in life, objects are encountered that have either a narrower or wider set of qualities than a certain set. All such objects belong to other classes. But at the same time, objects of any class are either partial or encompassing analogues of objects of the class under consideration, which is characterized by a certain set of qualitative features. Thanks to partial and encompassing analogues, all classes of objects, recognizable by any set of qualitative features, mutually penetrate one another. Well, and in the end, real objects merge into what we call creation in all their plurality. But in our world perception, the mutual penetration of different classes of objects into each other, their imposition on each other, depending on which system of delimitation we use, we see either boundaries or erase the boundaries between objects, going up to the chains of generalizations from some particularities to the concept of creation. And on the basis of such an approach, a supersystem is defined as a plurality of elements that are at least partially functionally similar to each other in a certain sense, and at least partially are interchangeable. This is the basis for determining the concept of a supersystem. In the previous lectures, when we were simply engaged in a consideration of the conceptual apparatus of the sufficiently general theory of governance, this was omitted, and the definition of a supersystem was given, in fact, in a shorter form. That it's a plurality of elements that have three features. They are governed on the basis of information and algorithmics that are in the memory. They can give out information into the external environment and can receive information from the external environment. Therefore, the supersystem, under the impact of information exchange, is somehow governed, and every one of its elements, receiving information from the external environment, changes its informational algorithmic state. But you yourself understand that if the informational algorithmic support of an element changes, then it can begin to solve those tasks for the solution of which it previously did not have informational algorithmic support. And accordingly, if you transfer information, algorithmics, into a certain element of the supersystem, and the reaction of this element to the new information embedded into it is predictable for you, then you govern this element of the supersystem. And through it, you can govern the supersystem as a whole. If, under the impact of this element, the character of the supersystem and the processes taking place in it changes. Further, there are processes in this plurality of elements. There are processes flowing inside these elements. If we correlate with real life, then how do these processes flow? They flow in a matrix of possible states and ways of transition from one state to another. And by strength of this circumstance, by strength of the fact that the supersystem represents a plurality, and although all elements are in some sense analogous to each other, but by strength of the fact that the information in every one of them, the algorithmics in every one of them, are not identical to the information and algorithmics which is in other elements. Every element has some of its own peculiarity that distinguishes it from any other element and from the entire set of elements. Such pluralities are described by probability theory and mathematical statistics. Therefore, supersystems are also described by probability theory and mathematical statistics and processes in them, on the one hand, programmed by their state of information of the elements that are included in the supersystem, and on the other hand, they flow in line with the probabilistic and statistical predeterminations, which are conditioned by statistics, the programming of these elements of the supersystem, their informational algorithmic peculiarity. If we correlate with the reality of history, then the aphorism of Vasily Osipovich Ключевsky is connected with this. The regularity of historical phenomena is inversely proportional to their spirituality. So the word spirituality in those days, this was the word in which information and algorithmics were hidden, that is, the regularity of historical phenomena, and regularity in science is understood as the repeatability of phenomena under certain conditions. But the repeatability of phenomena is conditioned by the unchangingness of the informational algorithmic state of the supersystem, if society is considered as a supersystem. But if there is a change in the informational algorithmic support of the supersystem, then the reaction to the same circumstances of the supersystem may differ from that which was before, and the repeatability is accordingly lost. And the aphorism of Ключевsky reveals that if society, considered as a supersystem, changes the information and algorithmics on which many people build their behavior in life, then history does not repeat itself as twice 2 is 4. But something new occurs. What new occurs? And this is determined by how the informational algorithmic support of the behavior of the supersystem in general, and its elements in particular, changes. And again, if we talk about this, then the position "one in the battlefield is not a warrior" turns out to be incorrect, because the appearance of new information in the supersystem can change the quality of information, the quality of informational algorithmic support for the behavior of the entire supersystem as a whole, and, accordingly, change the reaction of the supersystem to the course of events of life. Further, the question arises, what is a supersystem in the concretics? In the most primitive case, a supersystem is a flexible automated production, together with personnel. If production is completely automated, there are elements of artificial intelligence, self-learning programs are present, then, in some aspects, it can work without personnel. How can it work? Well, later, I think, 3D printing technologies will be introduced. They will be perfected, and those works that now require a whole set of machine tools of different standard sizes, different profiles, many of these works will be performed simply by 3D printers. If you need one item, 3D printers will print it exactly the way you want. If you need a differently organized item, those same 3D printers will give you that item. If the system works for a mass consumer, then, in principle, it will be able to satisfy the individual needs of every consumer. This is exactly what is impossible in conditions when production is organized as a certain set of technologies based on narrowly specialized equipment, which is non-interchangeable, or interchangeable only in the hands of a virtuoso machine operator. This is the most primitive variant of the supersystem. Humanity is a supersystem. Any society is a supersystem. Here, too, there is a partial or complete interchangeability of people. Humanity is two sexes. There are activities that are not accessible to men. There are activities that are not accessible to women. A man cannot give birth. A woman can give birth. A man cannot breastfeed a child. A woman can breastfeed a child. There are activities that can be done by both men and women with approximately the same efficiency: walking, driving, and so on. There are jobs that can be done by both, but the effectiveness of the activity will be different. In particular, physical work, when it's required to cant heavy things. In principle, women can also do this, but it's better when men are involved in this kind of job, because men are stronger. When it comes to individual work, if it is the same, monotonous, then women do this kind of work better than men, simply by virtue of their peculiarities. But, nevertheless, humanity with two sexes is a supersystem. Both men and women are supersystems embedded into this supersystem, as well as children, also, thanks to their age and characteristics of the sexes, also form their own supersystems. But if we go beyond the boundaries of humanity, then humanity is a part of the biosphere of the planet. And all biological species, all populations of biological species, also form supersystems. And thus it turns out that the biosphere of the planet is a supersystem. And so we slowly, in the order of generalization, reach the point that creation, this is a supersystem. But if we have no idea of what a supersystem is, then we cannot reach a certain level of generalization, which is necessary in order to understand the processes that take place in supersystems. In this case, we are faced with the need to describe and model the concretics in a plurality. And a plurality of descriptions, a plurality of models of various concretics that we encounter in life. They form the informational barrage under which, in fact, culture can simply break down. When we have the concept of a supersystem, then, in this case, we can reach a certain level of generalization which allows us to see a lot of particular manifestations, certain general objective laws that are characteristic of processes in a supersystem. On the one hand, this saves us from the accumulation of variable factology in colossal volumes. Well, on the other hand, it allows us, in a number of cases, in the concretics of some manifestations, to see what we could not see before, because behind the plurality of particularities, we did not see the process as a whole. So the proverb, "can't see a forest for the trees," quite often turns out to be functionally operable and meaningful. What else? One of the key concepts is the concept of mutual nestedness of supersystems into each other. What is this based on? It is based on the fact that if there are several supersystems, then there may be elements that belong to both supersystems at one and the same time. On the one hand, each of these supersystems has its own features, because these features are inherent in all of its elements. And on the other hand, these elements, which have features inherent in the elements of both supersystems, are not, in one way of consideration, elements of either of these considered supersystems, because the set of features that characterize each of them is wider than the set of features that characterize the elements of a supersystem of one or the other. That is, this is a certain element belonging to another class, and, by a set of features, it goes beyond the boundaries. Well, here is the simplest example. There is a society. It carries its own language that unites it. There is another society. It carries its own language that unites this society. And if representatives of both societies come into contact with each other, then there is a language barrier between them, and they do not understand each other. But in both societies, there can be people who speak several languages. And such a person can communicate with representatives of one and the other society. The language barrier between him and the other society does not exist. But such people can be in both societies. Each of them, on the one hand, is an element of his society. On the other hand, he is included in the neighboring society and can function as its element if he remains there for a more or less long period of time. And the mutual nestedness of supersystems again leads to the concept of virtuality of the structures of supersystems. Because, you see, the world is the way it is, but our relation towards it is always subjective. Therefore, depending on what characteristic features we collect in a single set, we will get one or the other delimitation of supersystems. But, again, following the example of humanity, if we include the feature of language, humanity breaks up into a plurality of culturally peculiar societies, primarily in the aspect of language. If we exclude language from the characteristic features, then humanity, in a certain sense, turns out to be united. And it turns out that it is simultaneously united and divided. And the only question is, in what cases, when solving some specific problems, we can ignore this disunity, and in what cases we cannot ignore this disunity. Because if we are talking about the need to resolve the global biospheric social ecological crisis, then linguistic disunity does not interest us very much, because we must operate with another phenomena. We must look at technologies that are used in different societies. What do they take from the natural environment? What do they throw out into the natural environment? We have to see whether they throw it out here, or they transport it somewhere and throw it out there. But if we, having considered this aspect, ask ourselves the question, how to liquidate, then we are faced with the problem of intercultural communication. And we must already take into account the language factor. And the question anyway remains, is humanity united or divided? And the answer to it is virtual in character, conditioned by the circumstances, by the tasks that we are going to solve, and by our way of world understanding, our cognitive creative culture. Further, when everything was brief, the intellect was not conjugated with the supersystem. But, in the general case of consideration, intellect must be conjugated with the supersystem. Why? Because intellect is, after all, a pan-natural phenomenon. Creation is, as a whole, reasoning. And intellect, by its purpose, solves a very simple, in terms of the formulation, task: multivariate prognosing of the behavior of objects of governance with the objective of selecting the best variant of governance and the implementation of this best variant in life. Solving this simple in its formulation task, the intellect is engaged in cognitive creative activity. As a result of cognition, it reveals what already exists and reveals the possibilities of creating what does not exist now, or what did not exist in the past. Creativity begins when these possibilities are realized. But again, the border between cognition and creativity is conditional, virtual, and subjective. Supersystems are also different. Therefore, intellect as a pan-natural phenomenon in relation to the supersystem can occupy different positions. It can be external. Well, the intellect of creators, operators, is external in relation to the supersystem, if the supersystem is a flexible automated production. A supersystem as a whole, selected from intellectless elements, can possess intellect, or its elements can also possess intellect that are selected from elements which are intellectless in and of themselves. Man is a carrier of intellect. Are those nerve cells from which his nervous system is assembled carriers of intellect? Well, the question is open, because from the point of view of human intellect and the currently taken shape world understanding, cells are not carriers of this intellect at least. It is possible that they are the carrier of intellect of some other level, with which the intellect given to the human organism does not have any channels of interaction, of informational algorithmic exchange. Therefore, one way or the other, in the general case of consideration, intellect is always connected with the supersystem. It can be external in relation to the supersystem. It can be internal intellect of the supersystem as a whole, although the elements that form it are intellectless. And this can be the intellect of the elements of the supersystem. But at the same time, one must understand that if there is an exchange of information between individual intellects of the elements, then the supersystem as a whole is characterized by a certain, conjugated with it, collective intellect. In the first editions of the sufficiently general theory of governance, the term subordinal intellect was chosen. Well, if we understand by subordinate the collective psyche of people, which works in such a way that the will of everyone is a conflict-free supplement to the will of all others, the will of all others is a conflict-free supplement to this individual will, then the subordinal intellect of the supersystem is the ideal to which it must strive, because the collective intellect of the supersystem as a whole may not be subordinal. In this case, within the supersystem, conflicts of governance are possible, generated by more or less functionally independent segments of this collective intellect. That is, in this case, a collective schizophrenia will take place in the supersystem when part of the elements of the supersystem works towards achieving some objectives, and another part of the elements works towards preventing the achievement of the first objectives and the implementation of some other objectives. This is all possible too. So, one must nevertheless understand that, being a pan-natural phenomenon, an intellect is always conjugated with a supersystem, and in some cases, in the processes taking place in it, one way or the other, several intellects, both internal and external in relation to it, and up to the hierarchically all-encompassing governance, behind which stands the intellect of the Almighty. Therefore, in fact, this circumstance must be borne in mind, and the term conjugated intellect must be used every time pondering on how it is localized in relation to the supersystem that you have singled out in the concretics of your activity. Supersystems are different. So the question of classification arises. One of the types of supersystems can be called ossified. It is characterized by the fact that it exists in some way, as long as its constituent elements exist. And, accordingly, if the elements disappear, then the supersystem also disappears. Or there may be supersystems with a renewable element base. Such supersystems exist in these or those modes for a long time, and during this long time the elemental composition of the supersystem is renewed. How can such supersystems exist? Differently. Ossified supersystems are, for the most part, a product of man. Various kinds of technical supersystems. As long as the element base exists, the system functions. As soon as it has disappeared, exhausted its resources, the supersystem itself ceases to exist. Ossified supersystems and those with a renewable element base of a technical character, they can transform into each other. If you are not able to organize the production of the elements from which the supersystem is selected, then, upon completion of the resources of the elements, it will cease to exist. If you can renew the element base, then the supersystem will exist as long as the element base exists. In technology, in the technosphere, this is often a matter of import substitution. That is, you can buy something from abroad, but if the supply of components and service stops, then this something ceases to exist. If you are able to provide import substitution or your own development, then yes, it will exist for you. Well, an example of this kind of supersystem is a railroad. Russian railways are fully provided with what is required for their functioning: locomotives, railways, wagons, all kinds of railroad equipment, railroad switches, and so on and so forth. But there are countries in which there are railways, but everything that is necessary for their stable functioning, they import from the outside. If the import flow stops, then, within some time, the supersystem degrades. Further, a special question is supersystems that reproduce their quality invariably. There are supersystems that evolve. That is, if you consider a supersystem at different stages of its life cycle, then you will see that the quality of the functioning of this supersystem differs from what it was before. Well, examples of what is renewed in an invariable quality are any species in nature besides man. So, all trees, all living creatures that live and form our biocenoses, they are unchanging in the continuity of generations. Yes, there are natural cycles. A very interesting film was once shown by the BBC in a savanna. How did they do it? For several decades, they filmed the same scene with cameras on tripods mounted in the soil. Well, in the course of several decades, cameras captured how the weather changed, how the savanna was replaced by a forest, how the forest burned down and again became a savanna, how the biocenoses in this region changed. But in fact, taking into account the cycle of changes, everything is unchanging. Humanity is an example of an evolving supersystem, because if we consider humanity at different stages of its historical development, even if we consider a people at different stages of its development, then we will see that in some regions of the planet, life flowed unchangingly for centuries. And in some regions of the planet, civilization changes the quality of life. And thereby, it affects other regions of the planet where civilization is culturally peculiar and unchanging. And under the impact of this effect, cultures either disappear or begin to be modified, and a change also occurs. Therefore, evolving supersystems are a special class. And what happens in them, it can be both beneficial in relation towards them, and can be destructive in relation to them, and it can be beneficial or destructive in relation to the surrounding supersystems. Therefore, if we talk about evolution as such, then evolution can be twofold. Either it can be the evolution of development, or it can be the evolution of degradation. Perhaps the processes are such that in them, evolutionary development is partly degrading and partly developing. That is, evolution can include two components. If degradation takes place, degradation proceeds stably, then this type of degradation ends with the disappearance of the corresponding supersystem from creation. If development takes place, then the development ends with the fact that the supersystem carries out its entire life cycle and generates something new. Or, before the end of the life cycle, it reaches a certain new quality, and something new also begins, which did not exist until that moment when the quality was achieved, until the previous potential of development was exhausted. Well, here you can hear the term potential of development. In general, this is also a very important term, behind which there stands a certain set of phenomena. What is the potential of development? First, it assumes the presence of a supersystem that is embedded in the environment and is able to interact with it in a certain stable way. If you introduce a supersystem into the environment and it is not able to interact with it, then the environment will simply destroy it. And there can be no question of any further development. If you introduce a supersystem into the environment, it interacts with the environment, it stably abides in the environment. If it fully satisfies the objectives and tasks that you entrust to it, this is one situation. But if you proceed from the assumption that the impact of the environment can be variative, and that quality of the interaction of the supersystem with the environment is only the minimum level that you can be satisfied with, and you need a more effective, in a certain defined by you sense, interaction of the supersystem with the environment, then this means that even before the stage of introducing the supersystem into the environment, you must build its elements in such a way that there is a certain potential that will be mastered after the supersystem is introduced into the environment, begins to stably interact with it to a minimum, and reach some new quality in which it will interact with the environment to the maximum, solving any tasks that you entrust to it. Such an approach presupposes the presence in the supersystem, in its elements, of two levels of informational algorithmic support for its behavior. The basic level, it must provide a minimum, and the variative level, which, at the moment of the beginning of the interaction of the supersystem with the environment, may not be filled at all, but in the process of interaction, it must be filled with some information and algorithmics. And depending on what information and algorithmics this variative level will be filled with, such a supersystem capable of evolutionary development will either develop solving the tasks of interaction with the environment that you entrust to it, or it will begin to degrade. And then you will get a negative result, not the one that you would have liked. Concerning the theme of degradation, there is a description of the experiment with mice, which is widely known on the internet, which received the name Universe 25. An artificial habitat was created for mice, in which there were no problems with food, no problems with water, no problems with nesting sites, and, in fact, the capacity of this artificial ecological niche was larger than the number of the population initially introduced into it. And one might say, what can happen? Well, if there are no problems with food, no problems with water, no problems with nesting sites, the population should grow and everything will be fine. However, the experiment, carried out repeatedly, showed that in such conditions, after the passing of some time, the process of degradation begins, and the population ceases to exist. Why? There are two reasons. First, if such a population is considered as a supersystem, then this supersystem is incapable of evolution, which would be a supersystem characterized by the reproduction of a certain quality. Why is the quality not reproducible? Because in this system, there are no factors of the environment that have an impact on all populations of the biological species in the biosphere. There are no food chains, no closed food chain cycles, because in reality, everyone eats someone. But those who eat someone, in turn, are also eaten by someone. Plants feed, herbivores feed on plants, carnivores feed on herbivores, more powerful carnivores feed on other carnivores. When carnivores die, others die, bacteria feed on them, and bacteria, in turn, is fed by the plants in some way, or the products of their vital activity. That is, everyone is eaten by someone somehow. When conducting this experiment, the mice found themselves in such conditions that no one ate them. And the mechanism of natural selection, on account of which, first of all, defective specimens are eliminated from any population, ceased to function. If defective specimens do not live in natural conditions to reproductive age, or are destroyed right at the start, then the population retains genetic health and can reproduce itself. But in these conditions, the mechanism of natural selection was excluded, and it turned out that degradational processes were activated by the fact that no one ate or destroyed defective specimens in any way, and by strength of the fact that there was no intraspecific competition, they continued to produce offspring. And then what happened, happened. If we consider humanity as a supersystem, then it is a supersystem that has the potential of development. It has an intellect that can solve tasks of development. But if the tasks of development are not solved, then, in essence, man is no different from other representatives of the biosphere of the planet. And the question of whether this supersystem will follow the path of degradation or the path of development is, first of all, conditioned by the attitude of man himself towards this problematics. Further questions about the dynamics of the mastery of potential of development arise. Well, the dynamics can be different too. Because in the whole plurality of possibilities, there are usually many ways to achieve the same objectives. Therefore, you can move to the objective in a roundabout way, or you can take the shortest path, or the path that is optimal in some other sense. In general, it is always preferable to go the simplest way, but the movement in the simplest way requires far from the simplest governance, because movement in a simple way presupposes zero statistics of errors of governance, as a result of which the process of governance falls into some kind of dead end or roundabout paths from which you then have to return to the simplest path. At this point, we finish the thematics of section 13.1, the concept of supersystems. Therefore, I ask you to read section 13.1 on your own, the preliminary materials of the training course, the sufficiently general theory of governance, and correlate what you have read with what I have said, and with what you yourself perceive from the text, and from what I said, and correlate all of this with life. That is, your task is to form the concept of what a supersystem is, what classes of supersystems can be singled out. Maybe you will add some more, to the classes of supersystems that I have named. This will also be useful in order to use this instrumentarium in the concretics of your activity. Thank you for your attention.